Mass-produced fashion these days is often so cheaply and poorly made it's virtually disposable after just a season or two of wear. In 2018, the American Apparel and Footwear Association reported that 26 million pounds of clothes were burned or sent to landfills. Part of the issue is that much of the fabrics used in today's clothing are made from petroleum-based synthetic fibers, such as nylon, polyester, and acrylic. These materials don't recycle as easily as natural fibers like wool and cotton. They're also not as durable and long-lasting, leading to a sped-up cycle of buying new pieces. For fashion enthusiasts like Sofi Thanhauser, this current landscape has made her look back and question how we got here in the first place. Thanhauser is the author of Worn: A People's History of Clothing. As a teen, she lived on Martha's Vineyard, an island off the coast of Massachusetts. It's a popular vacation spot for wealthy, seasonal visitors.
I am a person who has always enjoyed getting dressed up. Like many children, I took a lot of pleasure in the game of dress up. And as I got older, began to shop in a place called the Dumptique.
That's where summer guests dump their unwanted items at the end of the season. Things like games, craft kits, and an assortment of gorgeous clothes, all free for the taking.
I just came into some really stunning stuff as a teen and kind of developed a little bit of a taste for clothes that maybe wouldn't have really even crossed my path otherwise. But the story of how I came to write the book has a lot to do with coming to understand the history of clothing in the very narrow sense, like the last 30 years of clothing production. And some of what I was seeing in thrift stores was that a garment from the 60s or the 50s or the 40s, say, might, to my eye, have been a lot more durably constructed than something that was available to me at TJ Maxx. And I started to wonder about the quality of clothing and why it seemed to me to be declining.
As she grew older, Thanhauser continued to question how something many people love and take such pleasure in could also be the source of great pain and suffering for some.
I had enough awareness just coming from the press. Every couple of years in the 90s and early aughts, there would be some story breaking about sweatshops in Asia, and you'd have the glimpse for a moment of the fact that something was really, really wrong in the garment supply chain, and then it would kind of disappear. And I just sort of started to collect stories like that, and I knew the story of American slavery. I mean, not as well as it was handed to me in my public school education, which is that it's centered around cotton. And so I sort of started to think about, what is clothing really about? Is it about slavery? Is it about sweatshops? This seems like there's a lot of really distressing stuff to unpack here.
Thanhauser began her search for answers just a few miles away from the Dumptique, at the site of a historical colonial house built in the mid-1700s. Like many homes constructed during that era, it has a noticeable missing feature by today's standards: no bedroom closets. Back then, ample closet space wasn't a requirement because most people had just 2 sets of clothing, one outfit for everyday wear and a second for Sundays. A single hook attached to the wall was enough for a wardrobe. But today, for many Americans, it's a much different story.
A boom industry in the last decade has been actually storage units, and people kind of outpacing the ability of their own homes and their own closets to contain all of their physical belongings, a lot of which are garments. And since 2005, the amount of garments that we wear has just about doubled. So it's accelerating now at a rate that's just exponential. How did we get from one hook to so many clothes that we actually need a storage unit to contain them?
Now, the way in which many shop is focused on quantity rather than quality. New trends, the ease of online ordering, and a constant flurry of sales all feed into people buying clothes more frequently. However, many of these trendy clothes from larger retailers are made with synthetic fibers. While these pieces may cost less, they're not as long-lasting. On the other hand, colonial Americans made clothes from linen, a durable cloth that could be worn day in, day out, for years before it ripped or frayed and had to be replaced.
Linen comes from flax, which is a plant that bears a very beautiful blue flower. And if you take away the outer husk of this plant, inside there are these very fine and durable strands. So from pretty early on, humans have been using some sort of vegetal fiber to make clothes. So the oldest threads and garments and textiles that we have in the archaeological record are something very close to linen.
Linen was replaced by cotton fiber, which was easier to make into thread for weaving. When the cotton gin was invented in the late 1700s, it revolutionized clothing production. Unfortunately, this industrial boom and the greed surrounding the resource ultimately led to exploitation of human lives, thus beginning our nation's bloody history of slavery.
Cotton has been grown in vast monocultures. So taking whole huge areas of land and just growing one single crop. And when it's grown that way, it exhausts the land quite quickly. So part of what the devastating story of cotton in America has been about is cotton plantations that exhaust the soil very quickly using, as we know, the labor of enslaved people, and then moving on as soon as the soil is exhausted. And that was part of what pushed expansion and caused new swaths of land to be taken from indigenous populations. So peasants historically have cultivated cotton alongside food, but if you want to force people to grow only cotton and to either do that in conditions of enslavement or tenant farming, there's just a massive amount of coercion that's involved in that.
While slavery in the U.S. has long come to an end, there are millions of garment workers across the globe who are still heavily exploited. Laborers hired by many of the leading fast fashion brands are often subjected to long hours, poor working conditions, and insufficient pay. In recent years, media awareness is pushing more Americans to pay attention to how and by whom clothes are made. More buyers are asking, what's behind this cheap price? Where is this mass-produced, ready-to-wear item coming from? In response, some consumers are turning to thrifting or even opting to make certain pieces themselves, a trend that used to be the norm. Go back 2 or 3 generations and ready-made clothes were too expensive for most households. Making your own clothes meant a day spent poring over pattern books at the store, touching and smelling bolts of fabrics, and picking out matching thread, zippers, and buttons.
It's a really massive, massive shift in the global economy and in really the way the rights of seamstresses are upheld or not upheld that has led us to this situation. So in the 20th century, we had a big, fabulous garment workers union, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, that had created a situation where the people who made clothing were making a middle-class wage, they had insurance, they had cultural opportunities. And so of course, clothing cost, it was a significant portion of people's budget. And it was often cheaper to make your own clothes. And it's only since that union has been destroyed because of the way that the industry has been globalized that we have clothes that are so cheap. I mean, it in fact is often actively cheaper to buy a ready-made garment than to buy fabric to make your own clothes.
But despite this, some consumers are going against the grain and opting to focus more on quality rather than quantity. In fact, during the pandemic, a time when many people picked up new hobbies, retailers saw a rise in the purchasing of sewing machines. Across the U.S., a greater number of people are finding new ways to create sustainable, longer-lasting, and beautiful clothes. And if creating pieces from scratch isn't up your alley, thrifting is another fantastic way to give a second life to old clothes. There's no denying that the history of fabrics is an incredibly violent and bloody one. It's the story of oppression and power, of climate change and civil rights. But it's also a story about comfort, style, and self-expression. You can read about all these stories in Sofi Thanhauser's book, Worn: A People's History of Clothing, available now online and in bookstores. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio engineer is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
The coral animal itself actually has a translucent skeleton.
Did you know that colorful underwater coral reefs are actually living animals? Then,
it's a masterpiece of using building materials to create an artistic effect.
It's safe to say there's nowhere in the world quite like the Big Apple. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.